This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. We're counting on you. Every week, we bring you interviews with authors of books, research, and other things that have caught our attention.
Our guest today is Gili Hammer. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as well as the Program of Cultural Studies there. She's the author of a new book, her first book. It's entitled Blindness Through the Looking Glass, The Performance of Blindness, Gender, and the Sensory Body. It was published in 2019 by Michigan University Press. Dr. Gili Hammer, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, there are two axes to this study. One is blindness and the other is gender. Can you explain how and where they interact?
Yes, so this whole project started from my interest in gender studies. It started a long time ago when I was a young MA student in gender studies. I was always in anthropology, but I knew I wanted to focus on gender when I started my MA studies. It's a category that always fascinated me because I felt that it's really a core element of the way the world is organized around gender relations and gender identities. And at the time, I was very interested in the concept of the gaze, the way women are being watched and looked at in modern visual culture. I learned and read a lot about the surveillance of women in society, about the beauty ideal, the way women are represented in the media, the way women understand the way they are being represented. And I wanted to find a new way to think about the gaze, about visual relations. And this is how I came to think of the population of blind women, because I thought they could provide me with something that I didn't think about yet, with a new sociological, anthropological standpoint on gender and the way and the relations between men and women and the way we see and are seen in society. So this is how I came to think about blindness, and this is how I started to do research in disability studies more generally. But it really started with my interest in the gaze, in visual politics, in visual power relations.
Because the thing about blindness, Gili, you're an anthropologist, and ethnography is the main tool in your toolbox. And after all, what we see here, as you said, we live in a visual world. The gaze is something that is so basic and prevalent. And, sightedness is the default. And what you're studying by focusing on blindness is you're studying deprivation.
But is that how they see it? Is that how your subjects see it, that they live with a deprivation?
So I don't think that this was my intent. I thought that what I was thinking about is that the idea of blindness is also so central in the philosophy and sociology of Western culture, because we know the concept of the panopticon and the metaphor of modern power relations. What makes them modern is that we are all blind in some way to the power regime, and we discipline ourselves because the power is blind. We don't see the person who is disciplining us. So actually, modern sociology and Foucault think of all of us as blind. But in practice, no one has ever really studied blind people and blind women to understand what their experiences of this blindness, of this metaphorical blindness that we are all assumed to be living in, is about. So I didn't think of it as a lack of sight or lack of knowledge. I was thinking of blindness as a very central metaphor for the way we all live in modern visual culture, as people who in some way are blind to power, because if we go to the metaphor of the panopticon, we cannot see, the power is invisible. There isn't a specific person like in past times, like in history, who did the disciplinary punishments. So we all become our own disciplinary subjects. So I was thinking of blindness more as a very core experience that we all have, and not as a lack of something. And I wanted to actually challenge and twist this image of blindness as something that is lacking. I wanted to, in my very initial research proposal, I wanted to ask about how blind women challenge this specificity that accompanied with the way we think of blindness or the way we think of the lack of sight. And even back then, one of my first readers of the proposal told me, but wait a minute with the challenging thing or the resistance. You need to let the women talk about resistance before you think they resist something. But I remember that this was my very initial approach to blindness. I was thinking about it as a way of resisting visual power relations, as a way of challenging what we take for granted. So I actually was thinking of blind women as very relevant, like people who maybe could find an escape from visual power relations that we do not see or that we don't have access to.
And so what did you find? I mean, when you approached women who are actually blind, did they view their blindness as a metaphor or as a symbol of being free of certain kinds of power relations, or did they just see it as part of their lives on a practical level? Did they get your symbolic inquiry?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that everything that you mentioned is something that came up during the study. And another thing that I learned is that not only sighted people are affected by symbolism of blindness, but of course also blind people are affected by symbolism of blindness. They can resist it, they can challenge it, they can be affected by it. For example, as I belong to a gender group or ethnical group, I am affected by symbolism of this group. Yes, women are of course also affected by symbolism of femininity or gender. So the same for blind people or people with disabilities in general. Sometimes we forget that they also are affected by the symbolism of their own category. But yes, women talked very complicatedly about how blindness on one hand allows them to be very aware of, for example, gender norms or appearance management practices that many times sighted women are not aware of, and we take it for granted. So blindness allows them to mediate, if I would say. It's like something that mediates between the norms, the social norms of beauty or femininity or appearance, and between their own practice, something that we as sighted people don't always have, this mediation tool. For example, I remember one interview with a woman who was actually visually impaired. I had a few interviewees who were not blind but visually impaired. They could see something or a little bit. We can talk later about the biological aspect of blindness and how it works, but she could see something. And she told me, when I take a fashion magazine to my hand, because I don't see the full image, it doesn't jump on me right away. I need to decipher it slowly. I see a little bit of the eye, a little bit of the lips, a little bit of the hair, and then I can be very critical and reflective and conscious about the beauty norm or what they want to sell me as a woman. And that interview really helped me to think of blindness as something that, okay, beauty norms have to go through another filter before they get to the woman and before she gets to decide how she interprets it into her daily practice or daily skills.
Well, I have to say that when I was reading particularly the chapter on appearances, I was struck by the fact that these Israeli women you interviewed, I think there were about 40 of them, seemed to be proud that they were as careful about their appearance as sighted people. Maybe they had to go about it differently, but they really focused on taking some pride in styling their hair and the right haircuts and makeup and nail polish, jewelry, things that made me as a child of second wave feminism think, well, so they're just like, I mean, they're proud to be like sighted people in the sense of having adopted all the kinds of practices that we were taught were kind of oppressive on a gender level. What does it actually mean to them? I mean, how is that? I'd just be curious to know whether you think that them being blind, at least as I read their interviews, indicated truly a different approach towards their appearance when it seemed like they were striving to be more like women, including succumbing to some of these beauty norms.
Mm-hmm. So I would say it's more complicated because, first of all, what their knowledge reveals is the way visual norms are much more than visual, right? First of all, they teach us that all the sensory practices, including hearing and touch and verbalizing, speech, that many aspects, many sensory aspects goes into gender socialization. And this is very important because typically, as feminists or as sociologists and anthropologists, we hardly looked before at non-visual sensory practices that goes into gender socialization or socialization process in general. So this is the first thing that I would take from it. And then the second thing is that if I would be more precise, I think that what blind women talked about is that they use feminine grooming for their own purposes. And I say that I present the spectrum of feminine grooming that blind women practice. So not all of them want to practice very high, meticulous kind of feminine grooming, but they still know how to do it, or they are still aware of what society expects them to do. They very consciously choose what kind of practice they want to take and in which context. For example, if they go to the workplace or if they are at home. And one woman told me, you know what? I know that if I go to work and I have a spot on my shirt, people would say, oh, she's neglected, she's disabled, she's blind. And they won't say, oh, she just had something for lunch and she has a spot, like they would say on a sighted woman. So it's a very important tool to manage stigma. I talk about appearance as a very important tool to manage stigma. And just one more thing, and a tool that for blind women, very differently from other minority groups or even women with disabilities, they don't use it in order to do passing. So their goal is not to be a sighted woman or to look like a sighted woman or to even be considered a sighted woman, because most of them, because I interview mainly blind women who are blind from birth, their blindness is very visible. They use a cane or a guide dog. So they didn't want to pass. They didn't do it in order for other people to think, oh, this woman is not blind. So it reveals something very important about appearance management or management of identity in general, when it is not used for passing and when it is used as a tool to manage stigma or identity politics.
This relationship between blindness and sightedness is twofold, because on the one hand, it's how these women, the blind women, perceive the visual world, and on the other, as you mentioned briefly now, it's really how sighted people perceive them, and this ongoing, perhaps dialectical relationship between the two. Can you explain how it plays out for them?
Yeah. So as an anthropologist, I did the very classic anthropological exercise of researching blindness, also in order to go back to understand sight better, or sightedness. We usually go to far away or societies that are different from ourselves to better understand our own identity. So I did the same with blindness. And it was very important to me that mentioned that the book is not only about blindness, but that blindness is very important to understand better what it means to be a sighted person and how a sighted identity is constructed. So in the book, I also bring narratives, especially in the chapter on the sensory body, of not only blind people, but also sighted people who became friends with or work in the field of blindness, and then meeting people who see differently, literally, made them much more conscious about the spectrum of ways of seeing and their own identity as sighted people. Or, for example, when I discuss an ethnography in the Dialogue in the Dark exhibit, that I assume most people are familiar with, it's another site that actually more than
People in Israel might
origin-
be familiar with it, but can you briefly explain
Oh,
what
yeah,
it is
yeah,
for an
sure.
international
It's
audience?
an international, it's an international exhibit. It was also in New York City and many places around the world. It's in total darkness, and small groups of people, sighted people, come to visit the exhibit. They are led by blind or visually impaired guide, and they go through a tour in different environment, in the dark, a park, a boat, a music room, a market, and a small cafe at the end. And they assume it's a sensory experience. Sometimes it is marketed as a way to get to know blindness, to experience blindness. And it's an international, very large phenomenon. They had already more than 1 million visitors around the world. So in this exhibit, for example, I argue that more than introducing people to blindness, people experience their sighted identity and the way and how being in the dark is very different from the world outside. So this is one way to construct sightedness, for example, to go to another environment, and then when you go out to the light, you say, "Oh, thank God I can see," or now I understand how different being in the light is from being in the dark. So this is one way of constructing sightedness, a way that is more stigmatic and in a binarism way. And another more dialectical and dialogical way to construct sightedness is really through everyday interaction with people who see differently from us, as happened in other environment that I studied, in groups of blind and sighted people that work together or do an activity together, in education or sport or culture. And then people get to really rethink their own identity. And for example, in a conversation that I documented about books, people talked about different ways to access books or to do reading. One is through the eyes, the way we know it. Another one is through listening to recorded tapes. And another one is through touch, reading Braille. So, for example, this very small conversation really brought up different ways of reading and sharing knowledge to different sensory aspects. So I also wanted to bring in the book different narratives, not only of blind people, but also of sighted people or visually impaired people, that discuss the spectrum of ways of seeing and ways of being outside the politics of visuality, outside the only visual regime that this is, as you said before, the default of the way we think about the senses.
I was curious about something you said regarding being an anthropologist and going to another culture to study them. And you said that you wanted to, sort of go out beyond your own group as well. And I think what was one of the things that was interesting is when you began interviewing your subjects, some of them said to you, "Wait, are you blind?" And you wrote that question caught you off guard.
Mm-hmm.
Why was it so important to them, and why did it catch you off guard? What did it mean?
Yeah, so that's a big issue. It's something that really has accompanied me from the very beginning. So first of all, in disability studies, very justifiably, there is a very high sensitivity in terms of who is doing the research, who is writing about whom, who is the authoritative figure. There is a very famous slogan in disability studies, "Nothing about us without us," which resists a very long history of non-disabled people being the authority figures over disabled people, either in the law, for example, typically when a new law is going out about disability, the committee doesn't include people with disabilities to think about the very population that they want to make different for. So there's this very famous slogan, and also in academia, for most until the field of disability studies really started and became more serious and central in sociology during the 90s. The history of writings about people with disabilities was done by non-disabled people, and many times from a very patronizing view. I was reading most of the research I was reading about blind women were done to study them as, I don't know how even to say it, like it was about how blind people dream at night, or do blind women know how to choose their clothes? Very simple questions from assuming that blindness means lack of knowledge. So this usually was the assumption.
But this seems to be very much like like a similar problem when academic researchers study other disadvantaged and marginalized groups who traditionally did not have their own intellectual power structures until they entered academia, including women or people of color who have the same claim. Is this different for blind or other disabled people, or is it the same problem that we see, in the origins of, psychoanalysis, the writing about women by men, etc.,
or classical anthropology as well?
Of course. Yeah. It's very similar to classical anthropology, I would say. The main difference is that we are still not aware enough of the category of ability and disability. Even now, if you open a syllabus of qualitative research methods course or anthropological theory or gender study, okay, if you go and see what they teach now in 2020, students in gender studies, introductory to feminist studies, you would hardly find anything about women with disabilities. It's still not a category that we are used to think with. Okay, when my students write autoethnography or think critically about their subject position, we usually think of class, ethnicity, religion, maybe nationality. We still don't think enough about ability and disability, even though that just like gender, it's everywhere. And it's a very basic organization of society. So disability studies are still new, and people with disabilities and researchers with disabilities still struggle a lot in order to get their voice heard, in order to even get jobs in academia or to teach in academia. So it's a sensitive aspect, and I understand it. And this is something that I was very aware of, being a sighted woman studying blind women.
But you do raise an interesting question, I think, for academia in general, which is, on the one hand, I think that's a very important argument that you make. But on the other hand, do we conclude that only people from a particular group should study and write about themselves? I mean, isn't it part of our expanding humanity to be able to look beyond our own group and understand other communities?
Yeah, so I say a big no to this question. This is why I conducted this study.
Okay.
What I think is that we need to be aware of this, the history of power relations in the field that we go to study, and that we need to hear what's bothering the people in our field regarding their and our subject positions. We need to be aware of it. And then, no, we shouldn't, if we limit our research areas to only people like us, we wouldn't have sociology and anthropology or interest in research in general. I always say that I approach these studies as a woman living in a visual culture who negotiate my own appearance and embodiment, studying other women and people who live in visual culture, negotiating their embodiment and sensory experiences. I feel that we are in the same cultural boat, I would say. And also, of course, defamiliarization is something very important. We need to go to places and cultures that we are not familiar with in order to get a critical perspective. So I would say no to that. And regarding the questions that you mentioned before, that people ask me, are you blind? It surprised me at the beginning because, again, we are not taught to think about our sightedness as in a conscious way. We are not... I always, when I interview people for my now I study people with and without disabilities, not only with blindness but physical disabilities. So when I interview people who are not disabled, I always ask them now, how do you define yourself with a disability, without a disability? And very interesting things come up, because all of a sudden people who are not disabled think about it and say, actually, I have this and this, or I have this condition, or I don't know if I can say that I'm without any disability. It's still a category that I was not trained to think through or think with. So I wasn't prepared to be asked about my sightedness. But it was very obvious that blind people would like to know if I'm blind, or what brings me to study their group. And the last thing I wanted to say about it is also interesting to see which kind of studies have these questions. Usually when we talk about minority groups or disadvantaged groups, this is when the researchers is asked about his or her subject positions. Usually we don't raise this question in other contexts. I remember I was sitting in a panel in a conference on feminist studies, gender studies in UCLA once, and I was in a panel. It felt like they put all the weird subjects in this one panel. So they had blind women and other minority groups, and people ask us, why do you study it? How do you get the authority? Why do you think you can study these topics? And
what did they mean when they said, why did you, what they meant, how can you be authority because you're not blind? Is that what they meant? What did they mean?
Yeah. Okay. There was another scholar studying women in prisons. There was
and somebody said, how can you know anything about women in prison because you're not a woman in prison?
Something like that. They really challenge our authority and also not only authority, but I would say moral position. What allows you to do this study with this group as someone who doesn't belong to this group? It was even a moral question.
I'm trying to figure out if it's a critique of the left or the right or the conservative. I mean, what kind of critique is?
Or just pesky people.
So
Could be that as
what
well.
I liked about the way the other panel member answered is that, please note, she turned the ball to the audience and said, we need to note who we ask this question. Why do you ask me or her, a woman studying blind women, this question more frequently than you would ask someone else?
I'd like to go back to what you said earlier about gender socialization and gender norms. I mean, the thing about it is that we're all influenced by gender socialization, men and women alike. And I'd like to challenge you on your decision to focus on women specifically or exclusively, and not, and ask you whether you don't feel that you missed a layer by not looking at blind men as well.
I think that many of the observations in the book can be interesting as much as they can be relevant to sighted women. They can also be relevant to blind men. I think I have two reasons I chose blind women. First of all, because, as I said, I started this project from literature on the gaze and on visual power relations. And still, most of the scholarship and most of the even images in the media are focused on women rather than men. Men are, of course, influenced by it, and consumer culture includes more and more audiences, including people with disabilities. But the scholarship and the images and the of not femininity, but of gender norms and beauty norms are still more directed at women. So I thought that it would be very important to go to the most subjected to the gaze group that I can find, which are blind women, even metaphorically, in order to ask my questions. And the other thing is that women with disabilities, including blind women, faced many contradictions that men with disabilities maybe face differently. For example, there have been writings in disability studies that explained how femininity and disability images are very similar, right? If we think of stigmas on disabilities or people with disabilities, we think of maybe weakness, dependency, very similar to stigmas on women or femininity from one hand. But on the other hand, stigmas on femininity and women also include sexuality or things to do with appearance and beauty, while women with disabilities are excluded from this realm of beauty and sexuality in terms of stigmas. The stigmas on women with disabilities and people with disabilities in general is that they are asexual and that they would know nothing about beauty, or how can you be disabled and groomed or beautiful at the same time, or how pity it is to be a beautiful blind woman. Many stigmas around these issues. So women with disabilities, on one hand, are not accepted on the more masculine side because of their disability, because they are considered weak and dependent. And on the other hand, they are not accepted on the feminine side because they are considered as asexual or not belonging or having to do something with the beauty realm. So they faced contradictions that were very interesting for me from an anthropological perspective to ask about.
Yeah, although I was struck by a nice line in which in the chapter about romance and dating, where you explained that one blind interviewee said something like, "Well, if I prove how independent I am as a blind woman, then people can be intimidated by it.
Yeah.
But if I'm too dependent, then I feel like a dependent." And so I thought, so many women, who are considered strong, independent women face similar dilemmas, even if they're not blind. Let me ask you one more thing that I think we have to ask about, which is that most of your research was done on Israeli women. And I think that question about how the Israeli perspective may be different from a similar group in some other country or specific other countries, it was really brought home to me in one of the early questions I asked, this focus on, traditional markers of femininity in fashion and nail polish and jewelry. I used to joke that when I first moved to Israel, moved to Tel Aviv, actually, that I had never seen so many hairdresser and manicure shops in a single kilometer. And I think that Israel has a particular focus on some of those traditional aspects. Do you think that some of the ideas that came out of this research might have been different in countries with, let me be blunt, more advanced forms of feminism, or any other direction? I mean, I don't want to downplay or trivialize the feminism in Israel, such as it is.
Well, I think I try to give a dual look at this in the book. So I try to give specific attention to Israeli context in terms of appearance management and other categories. For example, in the chapter you mentioned about intimate relations, I also mentioned the military context, where in Israel specifically, women with disabilities face this exclusion from being the heroic disabled person, which is very specific to the Israeli context. So I try to give attention when the Israeli context came up, either it's about military context or religion, when I talked with religious Jewish women. But at the same time, I think, and I was also involved in the American disability studies context, and I lived there for 3 years, and I was involved with blind communities. And so at least I can talk about the American context, not on other places. I feel that there is something very similar about the way blind women, first, the way they are being stigmatized in general in visual cultures, either if they are more or less feminist. It's something about visual culture and very, very basic and deep stigmas and beliefs that we have about blindness, because blindness is such a very basic element of humanity, blindness and sight, all the myths and stories and folklore around blindness that we didn't mention, but it's so deep about the way we construct the human being as sighted, and blindness as either a punishment from the gods or a gift, a talent gift that gives you special powers. It's very, there is a research that shows how these myths about blindness are really universal in modern and non-Western cultures. So there is something very similar about the way blind women are stigmatized. and the way they need to negotiate visual norms of femininity and beauty, and to use it as a tool of stigma management regarding disability. So at least in the American context, I found similar notions and ideas. I do think that it would be interesting to look at maybe less visual societies. Maybe it would be interesting to look at societies or cultures that are less visual and emphasize other senses, and to maybe the concept of blindness would be different there because visuality would be less important in the hierarchy of the senses. So this is what I would think would be interesting to look at, maybe.
All right, Gili Hammer, an anthropologist at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and author of the new book, Blindness Through the Looking Glass, The Performance of Blindness, Gender and the Sensory Body. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And also big thanks to Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and again to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And do not forget to follow Dalia and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.